everybody. This is Church History for Chumps, episode 8. Well, thanks for joining us this time. We're going to be discussing the Salem witch trials, which, if you're a fan of Hocus Pocus or The Crucible or Handmaiden Tales, I think that has something to do with the Salem witch trials. This is going to be right up your alley. There's a lot to talk about here. And I think one thing that me and Tommy are going to get into a lot is that it's definitely not as cut and dry as we'd like for it to be. There are Christians who look at every story portraying the Salem witch trials as this attempts to drag the church through the mud. And there's a lot of, non-church affiliated resources that will call this a travesty of justice and just a big conflagration of misogyny and superstition. And while I don't agree with either side, there's a lot of truth to both angles, and we're going to explore that. And we're also going to goof off a little bit, because this was a fun one to get into, but also a little demony. So I don't know, maybe light a candle and say a prayer for us before you start listening. But thanks for being here, guys. We're looking forward to getting into it. Hey everybody, this is John Simon. Welcome to Church History for Chumps, and I am today with the esteemed, the honorable, the Thomas Duell.
Nice. When do I get to be like a doctor?
I don't know. When do you get to be like a doctor?
No, like an old school church theologian. Doctor.
Oh, like a church doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Who gives out those titles? I feel like you have to be dead for a while. There's a way you can be a doctor and be a living person.
Not interested.
It just takes a little bit more school. I don't know if that's really up your alley.
Nah.
Okay, all right, that's fine. No problem. Dude, it's our first podcast recording, just the two of us in a while. I almost feel a little rusty.
I know, it's been a minute.
Yeah. Well, let's hope we can just jump right in, which I think we should do.
Let's go.
So hey, listener, we are talking about something real interesting today. We're talking about the Salem witch trials. And I told Thomas earlier, I don't think I've had more fun researching a topic, because not only is there so much information, but people feel very strongly about this issue. I think, and we'll get into that. There's a lot of there's some people who I think see this as a misrepresentation of Puritan culture, and there are those who see this as the reason Christianity at that time was just the pits. So I don't know which side is correct. Only time will tell. So yeah, we'll jump into the story. And honestly, I got so overboard into this, I'm probably going to throw in a little bit of backstory, because there is a lot of interesting stuff to go into here. But if you're not familiar, if you haven't seen Hocus Pocus or The Crucible, maybe. Also, Thomas, I never told you this, but are you familiar with the play The Crucible?
No.
So it's Arthur Miller play, written in, I think, the mid-20th century. It was about the Salem witch trials, used a lot of the names of people who were actually participants in it, but it was an allegory for the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Like,
really?
Everyone getting called out for being a communist back in the 50s.
Yeah.
So it's real interesting. And I played the lead role in The Crucible in high school.
No way.
100%.
Man, your high school is doing some cool plays.
Call me John Proctor, man. That was my name.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've got a monologue saved for the end of the episode.
Let's go.
Oh man, I should have busted that out. That would have been a lot of fun. But yeah, so the Salem witch trials are, if you're not familiar, this was basically something that was happening in the colonial times in United States history. It took place between February 1692 and May of 1693 in Salem, which was a little town in Massachusetts. So what happened was there were some weird, potentially spooky occurrences that had happened, and it led to some widespread accusations, what many people have considered mass hysteria. Upwards of 200 people were accused of either blatant witchcraft or affiliation with witchcraft, and it ended up with 19 people being executed. So, kind of a rough time. Yeah, I don't know. That seems kind of a bummer.
I mean, if you think about it, it's like a lot. That's like a lot of people.
That's
in
a
a
lot.
small town to get.
I think so.
Just
here's my question,
neckties.
Dude. If you were neckties, yeah, got the old hangman's knot. What's your first line of defense if someone says, "I think Thomas Duell is a witch"? Like someone at your church says, I saw him playing with some crow's feet the other day.
Prove it.
Yeah, prove it.
Prove it.
Yeah. Where's the evidence?
Prove it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. I want to see video. Actually, you can deep fake anything these days,
That's true.
bro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is my second line of defense.
Yeah, that's right. So when they do prove it, you say that's not actually me standing by the big cauldron with the smoke coming out of it.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, so here's the thing. I know everyone wants to hear about the witch trials. I mean, a lot of you guys are really familiar. But I wanted to get into some of the history behind the witch trials because I think that was actually really fascinating. Because we're almost tempted to look at the witch trials as if they're these isolated events. But the witch trials were 1,000% a kind of leftover cultural experience that these former Europeans had taken with them from Europe, because historians called it the witch craze. But this idea of prosecuting people who the church and the state believed were in cahoots with the devil was happening basically since the 14th century. And so it's very interesting. There were two really key documents that I want to just share about real quick. They're both very Latin, and I think both really double as solid black metal band names. I think would be really cool. But the first one was the Canon Episcopi, and this one came out in the 10th century, and it was essentially this was during the early era of the Holy Roman Empire, and what they were saying was it's an excerpt from medieval canon law. And what they were essentially saying was, there's these superstitions about witches, about covens of women gathering at night and shape-shifting and flying around on broomsticks and stuff like that. And the church identified it not as a reality, but as a pagan superstition. And so they essentially said, look, you've got all these people, particularly people who are holding on to customs before the Holy Roman Empire entered and took over this country and this culture, who are saying that there are people who are selling themselves to the devil and gaining powers and casting spells. And this law basically said, it's bogus. That's superstition, it's not real. And it kind of presented this theology that said the devil only affects us in spiritual ways. The devil doesn't affect us bodily. And so really kind of tried to put that question aside. And then a few hundred years later in Germany, there was a new book written that was literally called A Witch Hunter's Guide, and the title of it is the Malleus Maleficarum.
Dude, bestseller.
Dude, it means the hammer of the witches.
Oh, dude, I was just talk about a band name.
Oh, 100%. Whoa. Yeah. Hammer of the Witches. And this one was basically, hey, forget everything we used to say. All this stuff about witches is 100% correct. And also, as the church/state, because they were kind of the same back then, you have a responsibility to prosecute someone who you think is guilty of witchcraft, because the devil is giving them powers. They are stealing and sacrificing our children. They are very dangerous, and they are compromising the safety and well-being of Christ's church, and they need to be prosecuted. And literally, this book had instructions for how you basically torture someone who you believe is a witch into confessing. The whole I don't know, Monty Python loves to play around with it, but that whole I don't know, if she floats, she's a witch. Right. If she drowns, then she's an innocent woman, or something like that. A lot of that is parody of what's actually in this book, that basically says, hey, forget what we used to say. this witch stuff is real, and the church has a responsibility to figure this stuff out.
So this was written in Germany, in like the 14th century.
Yep.
But they're still reading it a couple hundred years later in the Americas.
Well, I don't know if they're still reading it, but I think that the influence of what kind of the shadow this cast in the demonological world of how they understood not just witches, but the relationship of Satan to the human world, the influence of that never stopped.
Okay.
And so basically after this book is written in Germany in the 14th century, you're going to see witch hunts, much like what happens in Salem, oftentimes on a much bigger scale, happening all throughout Europe. I think especially in like France and Germany. And I mean, if you think like the Inquisition, a lot of that was against people who were perpetuating witchcraft. And so there's a lot of big scale witch hunts happening, which is kind of a bummer, because if you try to put Salem, what happened in Salem, into a vacuum, you're forgetting the fact that this was like a tiny thing compared to a much bigger movement, that this was kind of on the closing end of, like, this was near the end of the cultural witch hunts for Christian theocracies. And so now we fast forward to the year 1692, and we find ourselves in Salem, Massachusetts. Now, Salem is an interesting little town. I think the first thing that's worth noting about it was that Salem was a town that was known for just kind of the worst neighbors you could imagine. it had a very strong reputation as being super quarrelsome. And they were often bringing people to court, which is interesting because when you look at that from a New Testament point of view, you're actually not supposed to be taking people to court all the time. The church would encourage us to settle our disputes on a personal level,
right,
and to involve other authorities to kind of help us discern that. But these dudes were like bringing people to court constantly, and it was often over property issues and things like that. So-and-so's horses were grazing on my lawn, or this part is my territory but they're treating it like their territory, and all stuff like that. So it was already known to be a pretty quarrelsome town, and they handled their disputes with a lot of rigidity.
I read something about how there was a pretty big family feud that was going on in the town as well, between two families, kind of like a Hatfields and McCoys type thing.
Totally.
And people would fight about like the main fight. They would argue about, basically who was winning the feud, and like everyone in the town had kind of picked sides over this issue.
Yes. So there's also a lot of, and I mean, this stuff is by no means unique to Salem. This was early colonial America. Like, you got to think in terms of development. There's still plenty of small colony towns that just didn't last. They were either raided or killed by disease. So these dudes were not having a great cushy time. This wasn't, post-industrial revolution. They weren't comfortable. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of sympathize a little bit, but they're not a happy bunch. They don't seem to like each other very much.
Yeah.
And another thing that I read that was really interesting was that around this time period, England and France were engaging in a small war up in what would later be known as Canada, and because of that, there's all these refugees who are evacuating those areas, and they're basically settling in towns throughout the Northeast, and one of those towns is Salem. So you have this town full of people who don't like each other, who are religious and Christian, but are actually really given to dispute and quarrel and being very legalistic in how they deal with each other. And now you've got all these people from different cultural backgrounds who are adding even more instability to an already unstable context. And so things are about to get really interesting. So Salem is also having the darndest time of just finding a town minister to stick around for a while. There were a couple of ministers they tried to bring in from outside areas, and they always seemed to have a problem of either they couldn't agree to the right pay, or they couldn't agree to parsonage, and things were always complicated. And eventually they brought in this dude by the name of Minister Paris. And the bummer with Minister Paris is he's going to be very involved in this story very shortly. So eventually they settle on this guy by the name of Samuel Paris. He becomes this ordained minister of Salem. He moves over from Boston, and even then, people don't really seem to like him. They're having arguments about like his salary, and villagers are vowing to drive him out. And then everything kind of hits the fan on January 20th, 1692, where there are two young girls by the name of Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Paris. Now, if that last name sounds familiar, you're right, because Elizabeth is Minister Paris's daughter and Abigail is his niece. And they are basically taken in because they start acting really strangely. They have these violent convulsions. They're throwing their bodies around and contorting their bodies in weird ways. They're vomiting. They're making these weird sounds. People said that they kind of like gurgled these unearthly sounding intonations, and some would say they were barking like dogs. And like, doctors were examining them, and one of my least favorite takes on the witch trials was that, oh well, they were just goofing around like little girls would. Like, you know, the Puritans were religious, but they weren't uneducated. A doctor could look at two girls who were acting like this and be like, oh, there's something wrong. Like, they weren't just like, oh no, a child is barking like a dog, demon. Like, they were clearly like, something is wrong with these two girls, and it looks kind of demonic. And that led to them basically interrogating the two girls. They go on to accuse three women in town of basically casting spells on them, and then this just spirals into the frenzy and the mass hysteria into what we know. And like we said, over 200 people over this year-long process would be accused. 19 people would be executed, and things just get really, really fishy from here. So, I don't know. I said a lot. Tommy, you wanna throw anything in there?
Yeah. I think one of the big kind of talking points around the Salem witch trials is, what exactly did this process look like when you're like bringing someone in and you're accusing them? Something that was fascinating to me was they did have some sort of counter process that they were using, where someone could say, like, basically like defamation laws, where someone's trying to defame me, like I'm not a witch. And they had, I think, 15 people that made appeals like this, and 4 of them were actually granted, which again is like statistically large. You know, if you have 4 people in a group of 200 who are actually, you know, some jury says, oh yeah, like this person was just like mad at you. Like, that would make you think, especially if it's, you know, happening over a relatively short period of time. For sure. So I think that that points to something was wrong here with the due process. But they were using what was called spectral evidence. Yes. And this was like it was controversial even at the time. Like, when they were using this spectral evidence, there was argument going amongst the townspeople and amongst lawyers and other pastors. Like, everybody was kind of writing letters about whether or not they should do this. And in the early trials, I think they used a lot of spectral evidence. And basically what this is like is, if I took you to court, John, I could say, you know, I was visited by John's form in a dream, and he like tortured me in this dream, and like that could be seen as legitimate evidence. And they viewed that as like, well, if Thomas saw John's form in a dream, the only way that that's possible, and this is kind of connected to their demonology at the time, would be if John had given himself over to the devil, or basically signed off on the devil using his form. Right. And so that was like a legitimate witness to a crime that they would use as part of this. And I couldn't, maybe you did, I could not figure out if they like how they were doing the whole like more than one witness thing that like even Mosaic law calls for. Because it's a Puritan culture, I would imagine they were trying to do something like that. But I'm wondering if this whole spectral evidence thing kind of even overruled that.
Well, one of the things I read that I thought was really interesting was that the Puritans at this point in time were really decentralized. Like in American context right now, I could say Baptist, and that could mean a pretty wide spectrum of churches and organizations who may have a similar backbone, but how they function is very different. Mm-hmm. I think that's essentially how the Puritans were, and I think from the jump, this is a town and a community that is very religious, but I don't know if they're very biblical.
Right.
If that makes sense.
That was a huge takeaway I had and I've always struggled with this as I've grown to appreciate the Puritans, like many Puritan writers. Like I love a lot of stuff that has been written by Puritans and have been enriched by it. This is like not even the same thing.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the guys that I'm reading, are from kind of like Scotland and England, and they're writing really good stuff, rich theology and reflections on Christ. And then we see over in the Americas, by the time they're making their way over to the Americas, like the Puritan movement's kind of fizzling out. Mm-hmm. You do see a few people who are kind of like on the tail end of that, like Jonathan Edwards and
Whitefield,
George
maybe.
Whitefield, yeah. But it's kind of like you said, if we were to judge all Puritans based off the actions of these people in Salem, like that wouldn't be a fair assessment.
Yeah,
and
just
really,
like you couldn't judge Spurgeon by the Westboro Baptist Church, right? Just because the name kind of unites them. And it is an interesting conversation to get into how the larger Puritan church engaged with them, because, like I said, people, when it comes to like kind of analyzing the witch trials, I've noticed about 90% of them really want this to say this was a sign of widespread, not just superstition, but also misogyny in the church, and this should be called out because it was atrocious. And honestly, I would probably agree with about 80% of that, and I'll nuance it a little bit more later, but there is a kind of minority viewpoint that says that, well, the key ministers were not being listened to, and there were all the so the one key figure that everyone loves to fight about is Cotton Mather,
dude.
So what do you think?
I think that guy was a dog.
Yeah, well, he's interesting to me because Cotton Mather and his dad, Increase Mather, which, what a freaking atrocious name. Actually, I'd say both. That's a double whammy of terrible names. Cotton, I can kind of get around if it wasn't for them being slave masters. That's just weird. That's like a dude who owns a sweatshop whose name is Nike. It's like, dude.
iPhone.
Yeah, iPhone 10. Yeah. It's like, dude, like, all right, read the room, Mathers. Read the field, bro. Like, come on. So, and Increase is just terrible. Like, that's just not a good. Like, I hope when he started getting shorter when he was older, they change it to Decrease. But what a. I hope they had. I don't know. I want to know who else was in their family.
Some names are just meant to live in the past.
Yeah, that was not good.
You know what? Maybe several hundred years later, down the line, we find great-great-great-great-grandson Marshall Mathers.
Yeah, Marshall yeah. Whoa,
that'd be
all right.
Crazy time.
That would be.
So tell me about Cotton.
Yeah, so Increase had... So they're
both pastors, right?
They were pastors and theologians, and they were pretty impactful in the New England scene. So even though... I think they were both Boston bound, so they were connected to larger church communities, and I don't know how well the Puritan communities really stuck to like having a larger polity, but it did seem like they would listen to ministers on the outside of their explicit community. And so Increase was one of the dudes who really just kind of went along with everything he'd already known about the witch culture. And then Cotton, his son, and also Increase was one of the ones who actually developed this idea of spectral evidence, that, you could have some weird vision of what another person did to you and then bring that up as evidence in court, like you explained. So Cotton is interesting because you've got these two camps, one that wants to really put down the Puritan church, and one who wants to say, nah, they weren't all that bad. And they really are fighting about Cotton, because the people who want to decry the movement will say, well, Cotton really didn't do enough to discourage what they were doing. And Cotton was really kind of endorsing these trials. And then you've got the other side that says, well, but he also discouraged them from using spectral evidence too much. And later on in life, he would say maybe those trials didn't go the way they should have. And the fact is, both of those things are true. Like, he did write letters to individuals in Salem where he said, hey, spectral evidence should be a last resort. It should not be the first line of prosecution by any means. But he also says, you guys are doing a great job.
Yeah.
like you guys are doing a really great job with this witch hunting thing. And later on in life, he has letters where he's like, or journal entries where he's like, yeah, that witch hunt seems like it's aging poorly. Maybe I should have been a little bit more stern in stopping it. And then there's other times where he's like, you know what, F the haters, dude. I did a great job. I'm Cotton Mather. What are they going to say to Cotton Mather? So I think, honestly, the dude was kind of complicated, and I don't think he really stood up. I think he did reasonably flip-flop a little bit, because he wasn't sure what history was going to say about those trials.
Yeah. It seems like he didn't even know, kind of in the middle of it, exactly what he thought. Mm-hmm. But one super interesting story from all of this that I thought, this is, I think, one of the saddest things that I read. So there was another guy who, I think he must have been the pastor that came after Paris. Mm-hmm. His name was George Burroughs. Okay. And George was only pastor in Salem for like 3 years. They never paid him enough money. He never really clicked with the congregation. He ended up having to borrow money from someone in his congregation to like pay his bills. And so that's just problematic as the day is long from a biblical standpoint, multiple levels again. But he ends up having to like move away from the community. His wife dies. He's kind of like, George is having just some hard times, but he's also really athletic. And someone who he owed money in his church ends up in the middle of this frenzy accusing him of being involved in witchcraft. Mm-hmm. And some of the evidence that they use is they saw him lift a musket with one finger.
Dang. Okay.
Like that's their evidence for him being, which was widely considered not possible. But again, he's like athletic, and it's like kind of a weird thing to pick as your evidence if you're just mad at somebody.
Imagine if one of your congregants was like, yeah, I saw you throw that frisbee golf. Like, I think you're infected by Satan. Like, imagine just being so good at something that someone's like,
I liked that thing.
No, that's Satan, dog. Sorry.
So anyway, they convict him, and they're going to take him and have him hung. And right before he's hung, he recites the Lord's Prayer, which was in these trials. If someone could do that, they basically were like, "Oh, okay, well, you're not a witch. If you can recite the Lord's Prayer, then like a witch couldn't do that." Mm-hmm. So he does that right before he's hanged. And it seems like there was kind of this moment they're like, what are we going to do? And then they just hang him anyway. And so he's dying.
Always err on the side of hanging.
Yeah, and Cotton Mathers is there, like, presiding over this, and he's sitting on a horse, and he's basically like, he like kind of is trying to like calm the crowd because people are freaking out a little bit. And he's like, remember, like, he was, tried in a court of law. He wasn't a real, ordained pastor. And just that scene there was just so like, for me. It's just like, you've got like this guy who's kind of like a famous pastor, literally like standing there on a horse watching the execution of this pastor who's like poor and like down in the dumps. And when he dies, he's like, he wasn't a real pastor. And it's like,
if you're not ordained,
Yeah, man.
You're not ordained.
Jeez.
Yeah, you're some weak sauce. That's a bummer. Yeah, that is.
There was another really kind of gross story of, like, there was this old farmer. He's 81 years old.
Giles Corey.
I think so, yeah. Were you going to talk about this dude?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. He and his wife were accused of witchcraft, and he didn't even put up with it. He wouldn't like say whether or not he was or wasn't. He just like didn't answer their questions. So they employed this extremely archaic, like, medieval way. I forget, there's this phrase.
I think it's just called death by crushing or something.
Yeah, they just like kept piling rocks on his chest.
Well, they laid a board on him, and then they made him lay on the ground, and they put a long board across his whole body, and then they would pile rocks on the board until he was crushed.
Yeah, took several days.
Do you know what his last words were?
No.
More weight.
Oh, yes, dude.
Yeah, super metal. Yeah.
I love this guy.
But no, yeah, dude, and I think there's probably some conflicting stories, because one of the versions that I heard was that he had initially accused his wife of witchcraft, and then he recanted, and then he wouldn't tell the courts why he made the accusation or why he recanted, so they were like, he's probably a witch. Yeah. So they were like, well,
if you mess up dinner one more time.
He's like, I swear, dude, like, I've got the easiest out in the world. I live in Salem right now. I'll just tell them you're a witch. And he's like, wait, no, I was just messing around. What kills me is, like, if you've got some like 25-year-old like bodybuilder, yeah, maybe kill him with a bunch of rocks. But this guy is 81 years old. It's Polycarp all over again.
I know.
Why are we so excessive with how we kill the elderly, bro?
Dude,
this is
super old, especially in that time, dude. I didn't know people made it to 81 in the colonies.
He was probably surprised too.
Jeez.
Yeah, no, that story is it's a big time bummer.
More weight.
Yeah,
man,
no, super hardcore. And yeah, so, you know, like we've kind of been implying, the one of the big criticisms that I think is kind of made across the board in how these trials went was that because there was so much contention, because there was so much conflict, a lot of these accusations were not really in good faith, but they were accusations that were rooted in family feuds and rivalries and disputes over land and stuff like that. So it was not uncommon that, you know, if I'm having a dispute with the Duell household, and then, oh look, someone accused Thomas of being a witch and he gets hanged. Oh, sweet. Well, looks like that whole lamb dispute we were having is going to fall in my favor. Yeah. So there were a lot of ulterior motives for people to make these accusations, and that's why it just kind of became this huge just farce of justice. I will say my MVP story goes to this dude named, I think his name was Samuel Sewell. He was one of the judges, and essentially he was pretty heavily involved. I don't think he was one of like the big time judges, but he was definitely still kind of helping the trials go along. And later on in life, he like very clearly said that those trials were a miscarriage of justice, and he publicly kind of condemns them, and he repents and asks for forgiveness from the community for being involved in them. And then he publishes some literature calling for the end of slavery, calling that sinful. So I'm like, hey, yeah, as far as Puritans go, you hit both check marks, which is you repented for killing people, and and you stood against slavery. But yeah, it's so. Another thing I think we have to get into is all right, I did a little bit of extra reading in the Malleus Maledictorum, and I found this quote, and it's pretty atrocious. But this book essentially kind of ran with this theology that was not unique to the medieval time period, that women are especially vulnerable to demonic forces because they're the weaker sex, and because Eve was the one who was tempted and not Adam. And so this book of witch hunting literally kind of says women are going to be way more likely to be witches than men are, and has this quote that says, "All wickedness is but little to the wickedness of a woman. What else is woman but a foe to friendship, an unescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment." Really killing the alliteration right now.
That sounds like a Dairy Queen
A delectable detriment, an evil of nature painted with fair colors.
Shoo.
So, yeah, I mean, it's, and I think that the numbers I looked at said that of the hundreds, if not low thousands of people executed during the witch craze from the 14th to 17th century, 85% of them were women. And, yeah, I mean, you just kind of think of the standing that women had in society at that time, especially if they were unmarried. They really didn't have an advocate in society, and a lot of unmarried women were often the ones who were accused of witchcraft. And yeah, I don't know. I mean,
yeah, this is a time in history when like defense lawyers were, I think, a little newer. I'm not sure. I wish I had the foresight to study on this, but like having good defense lawyers in a court of law is like really important.
Yeah, and
something that I feel like probably was not fully developed in the colonies at this point. That quote from the Maledictorum is interesting. I feel like it is not incorrect to assert that there are certain sins that are more attractive to one sex or the other. I don't care to comment on like whether or not that's true for witchcraft. I can speak from my own personal experience. However, I do know, and in my day, men and women that are involved in witchcraft, and so I don't know, it's not something that's like exclusively reserved for one sex. However, I think that like that's not where the error lies, is saying like I think it's actually pastoral to like know that sort of thing. Like men in my congregation are probably more susceptible to this type of sin, and women are more susceptible to this type of sin. But what it doesn't have to be, and what it sounds like the Maledictorum does so terribly, is like connecting it to like it's also because women suck.
Yeah, right.
That's the part that is super problematic. Yeah, and what we don't see, I think, through a good chunk of the medieval period, and then especially here in Salem, is we don't see any like really good New Testament, New Covenant reflection on the spiritual realm at all. And you see, really what we see is this town, I think, suffering from a lack of knowledge. Yeah. Because, and I'm not, it wasn't clear to me reading this whether or not there was like zero demonic activity or like some demonic activity going on in Salem. But I'll say this, it might not be the demonic activity that you would think. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, when we read the biblical narrative, we see that the devil and those that work with him are always, at the end of the day, interested in the destruction of the human person, of the body, of killing people. Like, this is something that demonic activity always results in, whether it's spooky stuff or war or some sort of genocide or plague. And what we see going on in Salem is the destruction of the human body, but it's occurring through this corrupt court system. So I think you could say that there's just as much demonic activity going on.
Devil had both sides. Yeah, he was playing for the offense and defense. Man, dude, that's crazy. Yeah, yeah. No, I think you're spot on there. I mean, because this was look at the reputation that people to this day have of the colonial Christians because of this event. And I'm not even saying that like it's blown out of proportion. Like this was in every way possible a miscarriage of justice. There were people who were imprisoned for years, people who were executed, and just like tons and tons of disputes and rivalries, and like there was so much corruption going on here. And I have no doubt, I have a lot of confidence in saying that was just as demonic as what may or may not have been happening here.
Right. It really reveals a very poor understanding, cultural understanding of how Christ's kingdom works, and how Christ's kingdom can withstand like evil existing.
Yeah.
Like someone wrote, I think it was like 20 years later, there was a Quaker guy who wrote about this, and he said, "It were better that 100 witches should live than that one person be put to death for a witch which was not a witch."
Yeah.
And I think that's a good reflection. Where it's just like, oh my gosh, like we got so off base with this. And I mean, if we're trying to kind of maybe connect it a little bit to kind of our own day,
Sure.
I think we are seeing a resurgence in many ways of like an interest in witchcraft and a lot of stuff that's kind of connected with the new age. I think those lines are blurred a little bit. It's kind of becoming pop too. Like I was at the gym the other day, and there's a kid wearing a shirt that said "Support your local coven," you know. And I was saying to Rico, he and I were working out together, and I was like, "You think it's a game?" I was like, "It's not a game.
It's not a game."
And we're kind of treating it like it's a game. But for the Christian, and this is where I feel like the Salem stuff gets off base, the Christian's response, my favorite, and I bring this up, like this may be a little bit off base for our podcast, but I feel like a lot of people listening to this maybe might have this question of like, well, what if there was something going on in Salem? The biblical response to demonic activity, my favorite verse for this is in James, where it says, resist the devil and he'll flee from you. But then the way that we're shown how to resist is in the very next verse, which says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. And in the face of scary stuff, which is real, demonic activity, what the Christian is supposed to do is just stand firm in who we are.
Yep.
Remember your baptism, draw near to God, and that's it. There's no, you don't have to strap up and, head out to war against this stuff. Your place is, sitting with Christ.
Yeah. That'll preach.
Yeah, man.
That'll preach. Can I lose us some followers real quick?
Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah.
Can I?
Of course.
by all means.
Yeah.
I think there was some demonic stuff happening.
Yeah.
I really do. I mean, there's only so much we know, and again, like so many opinions, so much passion behind this. And I'll say that again, saying I think the way they handled this was horrible. I think that there was some deep misogyny in how they approached prosecuting witchcraft. However, when you go back to just the very beginning of all this stuff, and you've got two little girls who were puking and retching and speaking in incantations, and they say, I mean, and here's the part that really throws me off, is they accused three women of being witches. And two of them, I think one of them was like an older woman. One was like middle-aged, but was kind of distant from the community, didn't really go to church. And one was a Caribbean slave. She was a Caribbean slave woman. And modern readers are extra considerate of this woman in particular because she's the most vulnerable to being misconstrued or misheard or misunderstood or just taken advantage of because of her place in society, which I think is right. But like by all accounts, when she was accused of witchcraft, she was like, heck yeah. She was like, I sure did. Devil came knocking. And so
some of the stories about her, she was like teaching the kids in the town about like demon sex and stuff. Like,
yes. And so,
or
again,
as my brother puts it, sex magic.
and so, hey, we're so many years removed. Our opinions really don't matter at all. But if someone said $100 on the line, gun to your head, John, Do you think there was demonic activity or no? I would say, yeah, I think there probably was. Now, I also completely stand by what you're saying because, like, there is, I don't know, dude, like, so the reason I wanted to get into, like, those older texts and kind of how they informed modern and even, like, colonial, like, demonology is, like, the ideas are still kind of bubbling around us today. Because here's the thing. You and I, as modern, sophisticated men, would love to say, yeah, well, you know, we know a little better now. We know that, you know, we're not quite as superstitious as these folks may have been. We're post-enlightenment. But you and I both know, if you ever talk to somebody who's gone on a mission trip or who was raised in a predominantly non-Western culture.
Yeah, it's not a game.
It's not a game. It is not. Like, this is not just people waving around sticks with smoke and mirrors. Like witch doctors and just like the presence of witchcraft and demonic activity, like, it's real. And I say that as a very doubtful, skeptical dude, in that, like, if you talk to enough level-headed, rational dudes who come back from a mission field and say, this is what I saw with my own two eyes, it's just there. And so I'd love to be Mr. Modern guy and be like, these crazy little pilgrims were just seeing stuff. Like, he saw a little girl bark like a dog and was like, whoa, it's a witch. Nah, man, they might have seen something crazy. But again, I think you're totally right in that what breaks my heart and how this whole situation was handled was that it seems like there's so many Christian fundamentals that a Christian society should have been able to respond to. Like in what moment was there, like, deep prayer? In what moment was the community called together in this to, like, really pray and consider? Like, at what point did the minister, like, make visits to, like, you know, I mean, like, I don't know what to do when you've got potentially demonic activity in your community, but, like, they went straight to the litigation. They went straight to, well, let's make sure whoever's the cause of this gets a noose around their neck, and then we can go back to business as usual.
That is a really interesting feature of this.
Yeah.
I didn't really spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. It's like their response to the demonic world is the courts.
Yes.
And it's like, whoa.
And capital punishment. Like, you think, like,
which there is a little bit of a tie-in, like, if there's a culture that's trying to draw from Mosaic law. I mean, in the Mosaic law, it's pretty clear.
And theocracies do kind of have to lean in Mosaic stuff. But what kills me is, like, I don't see church discipline in this. I don't see calls to repentance.
Right.
I don't see, like, prayers to rebuke or cast out any of this, like, demonic activity. I see they're immediately like, our Savior is the magistrate. Like, that's what's going to redeem. And, like, literally, like, you're just hoping that you kill enough people that the witchy stuff stops happening. And I think the biggest bummer is, like, from the reading that I've done, there was something really off about how those young girls were acting, but that's all. Like, everything outside of that was just spectral evidence that was all thrown into these, like, weird motives.
Yeah,
but
they needed an exorcism, not an execution.
Yeah, that's good. That might be our tagline for this episode. They needed an exorcism, not an execution. Yeah. I love that. Yeah, so I mean, so yeah, when we look at this scenario, I do think, like, I'm king of the nuance. I love exploring complex ideas complexly. Was the church wildin'? 100%. Were they, like, 1,000% off base? No. Like, the town was quarrelsome. They were dealing with a lot of people from outside of their culture who were adding to the instability there. They inherited a culture that made them hypersensitive towards the idea of witches and predisposed them to prosecute witches rather than handle them in a more legitimate biblical way. Like, they didn't have a good minister to lead them through this. I mean, just the fact that, again, Minister Paris, what, like, the people at the nucleus of this supposed demonic activity were the daughter and niece of the only minister in this town. Like, how do you expect this dude to handle the situation sensitively? Like, there were so many factors that made this situation a powder keg that I don't think it's fair to say that this was just superstition and misogyny, but if you say that those weren't factors, then you're just doing revisionist history because you like Christian stuff, and I think that's dumb.
Right. Yeah. No, that's good. That's super good.
Yeah, but geez, this was fun.
Yeah.
Let's find some more witchy stuff to do. Let's not wait till Halloween, man. Also, how many studies do you have to do to put occultist on your, like, as one of your professions? Like, I read so many dudes who was like, oh yeah, such and such occultist or demonologist. Not that they were involved in it, but that they were well studied in it. I was like, yo, I will take some demonology courses.
You want that title?
I'd love to be John Simon demonologist.
Demonologist is different than occultist.
No, an occultist. Like someone who is familiar with the arts of the occult, but not through practice.
I'm not sure that's what occultist means. You might want to double check.
I think it is. All right, I'm gonna do some.
I think occultist means that you participate in the occult.
No, I don't think so. Hold on. All right, the dictionary.com says believes in or practices occult arts. That's rough. All right, well, hopefully the Lord does say he'll hold me accountable for every careless word, but that one was out of ignorance. So.
I know, that's when I was here
God's
to help.
like, you said what?
Yeah.
I was like, no.
Yeah. This is why you don't have a solo podcast.
But John Simon, demonologist? Come on.
Demonologist, that's better.
That sounds way better. I'd take night classes.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Catholic Church has official exorcists.
They do.
Yeah.
That's a dream podcast guest, isn't it?
An exorcist?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, we do... The Lutheran Church also has exorcists too, by the way.
I was thinking about Lutherans yesterday, dude, and I was like, man, Lutherans are like a dude who was in a coma for like 30 years, and he woke up and he was like, whoa, man, Tupac, best rapper alive, am I right, guys? And everyone's like, nobody really listens to Tupac anymore. Like, we kind of moved on. Like, I just feel like Lutherans are like, yeah, we still exercise, we still
I was texting with a Lutheran friend the other day, and they were like, they had to cancel a coffee appointment because they had to go to perform an exorcism on a building. And later on I was texting with them, was kind of teasing them a little bit in a group chat, and they were like, hey, in my defense, the walls were bleeding. Mm-hmm. So you know what, that might be a good podcast guest right there.
I
tell
guess
some stories.
But also, only Catholics do exorcisms, you losers, okay? Like, just catch up. No one else does this. Move on. But also, if the walls ever bleed in my house, I'm going to call about 12 different people on my contact list, because that's wild.
I'll be there.
All right. Hey, I'm going to need you there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're getting a little bit off track, but this was a fun episode. This was good. And hey, listener, I hope that you enjoyed this too. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Later.
All right. See ya.